Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Annalisa Ely and I am doing a nonfiction breakdown of the book White Rage by Carol Anderson. This is part of my What You Need to Know series. It's only the second one, so I'll be linking the other one down below and probably in a card. But the premise is that I read and take notes on a nonfiction book that I think a lot of people would benefit from the knowledge of, and then I tell you a number of key facts that the book looks into so you can get an idea of what the book's argument is, and pass along to you some information that I consider important. If it isn't at your library and you do have a local library, I highly recommend that you ask your library to buy it. Most libraries have a system like this in place, and this is something that really should be available at libraries at least across the US. I personally think that it should be taught in American schools in any American history class. If you do not live in the US, I still think that a lot of these facts will be edifying for you, and that if you look into the book, looking at its sources, a breakdown of which makes up about 45% of the 270 some pages, might help you to find sources that apply to your own country, because white supremacy is something that is spread across many nations, and I suspect that similar tactics have been used to keep it in place through the centuries across the world. To start, Carol Anderson coined the term white rage because as she was watching protests that were mainly led and initiated by Black people that were against white supremacy, she saw a lot of people talking about Black rage. Black people's rage was visible as they shouted and marched for their rights, but no one was talking about the white rage that was prompted by nothing more than Black people achieving some small amount of equality. Now, I will be using some direct quotes and a lot of paraphrases from this book, but everything that I am reporting to you is from the book White Rage, so all credit for coming up with these arguments goes to Carol Anderson. She says that white rage is hidden but pervasive. It is a reaction to Black people wanting and moving towards equality. And in the book, first the author starts off with a brief breakdown of how Black people have been treated in recent years and how the law has more recently been used to push them back down, such as the fact that in 1999, Blacks and Hispanics made up 50% of New York City's population, where 84% of those stopped and frisked in that famous little method that the New York police had. But the majority of illegal drugs and weapons were found on white people. The author spends a short amount of time talking about modern times, then she takes us back to the time directly after the Civil War, and step by step walks us through different time periods when Black people's rights would move forward, only to be pushed back by white supremacy. For example, the person who had written the Gettysburg Address and the Emancipation Proclamation made it clear to the rest of the government that he was not for Black people's rights or equality, and in fact met with the leaders of several Black communities to try to tell them that they needed to convince their people to move to Panama, of all places, and get out of the US because, and this is a quote from him, "But for your race among us there could not be war." I'm not going to bother to explain all the reasons why that sentence is ridiculous, as the author didn't either. It should be pretty easy to figure out. But this was brought up mainly as the author was explaining how the narrative of what the war was for was changed by Lincoln and Johnson, who came after him when Lincoln was assassinated, that the war was not to force the South to end slavery, but to force them to stay in the Union, although the reason they seceded was because the northern states were trying to force them to give up slavery. But anyway, this attitude change, along with the fact that the members of the Supreme Court were very conservative and that Johnson himself was very anti-Black people, resulted in various attempts by the Congress that was mainly run by liberal politicians from the North to force the South to give up slavery and everything remotely related to it, were made toothless, namely the 13th and 14th Amendment. For one, many of the southern states were allowed, when they ratified the 13th Amendment, which was a qualification for being allowed back into the Union, to add a bunch of their own caveats to it that basically said, but we don't actually mean this. And one state, Mississippi, was allowed to not ratify it at all and still be let back into the Union, and in fact did not ratify it until 2013. And when new states were added to the Union, which was something that was a big dividing point pre-Civil War about whether new states were allowed to be slaveholding states or free states, the new states didn't say they were slave states, but they were allowed to codify the exclusion of black people from voting rights and from juries. And the South was basically allowed to go back to exactly the way it was in antebellum. Almost all of the Confederates were pardoned, and then because all their constituents were still there, they were just plonked right back into leadership as governors and judges and representatives. And so the black codes became a thing, which were basically laws that applied to black people but not white people, so that black people would get thrown in jail for things that white people were allowed to do. Some of the black codes basically made slavery a thing again by saying that black people had to be signed up to a plantation. If you weren't signed up to a plantation, you were thrown in jail. Like, you couldn't do any other job, and since you had to be signed up to a plantation, they didn't have to pay you anything because they didn't have to compete for your labor, and they were allowed to whip them and basically do everything that was done under slavery. There was also something done by Congress right away after the war, which was to give the plantation owners land to the freed slaves, divided up into 40-acre chunks. They worked the land for a couple of years, and then President Johnson took the land back from them and gave it back to the plantation owner. Black people were also not made citizens. The Congress tried to get that through, and the courts didn't allow it, and because they were not allowed citizenship, they didn't qualify for things such as the Homestead Act, which is where a lot of white people today can trace their family wealth and their ability to not be in debt all the time back to land they were given via the Homestead Act. Oh, and they also started the thing where if you're in jail, you can then be sent out to do work for no pay, and then the people who run the jail you're in get money for that, which still happens today, and I don't know how the courts haven't made that illegal, because I can see how it wouldn't get through Congress because all the people who can vote aren't felons, but you'd think that some judge somewhere would do something about that. Anyway, it started way back then. Nobody's done anything about it. And also, Johnson wouldn't allow for the funding of schools for black people. They were segregated. Black people weren't allowed to go to school with white people, and they also no government funded schools for them, even though they were working, and obviously either they were paying taxes, or in the case of them not getting paid at all, usually the people they worked for were paying taxes, and obviously they had a right to that money. And there was also ethnic cleansing that went on in parts of Georgia and Mississippi because the white people didn't want black people among them. Then Carol Anderson takes us on to the Great Migration, which was a time when about 500,000 black people moved north in between 1917 and 1918, basically because of all the conditions I was just talking about. And this is like 50 to 60 years later of this going on, and there were also lynchings and killings in general. So at this time, 90% of the black people in the US were living in the South. This 500,000 was only 10% of them. So it seems like a lot, but there were still a lot of people who never left, partially because the white people made it so difficult for them to leave. Anderson goes into how black people found with bus passes were arrested and killed. A lot of states in the South made distribution and possession of the newspaper, the Chicago Defender, illegal. This newspaper was one that showed people in the South that there were jobs for black people up north, that there were wages that actually existed and you could get paid for work that you did, and basically preached against the South and showed black people that there was something different available to them. And so obviously people in the South didn't want the black people to leave because there's all this free labor and generally people to oppress, and people really like to oppress people. And they also made many other types of pamphlets and newspapers illegal that critique the South. They would stop trains physically, like get in front of them, and they would also blackmail them with the rigging of court cases. They would arrest people who were waiting to board the trains for vagrancy, among many other things. And then, of course, once they got to the North, white people in the North were also racist. So while it was better, it was not good. For example, realtors, landlords, the people who would give out housing permits had enough of a agreement amongst them that they would not rent or sell to black people in white neighborhoods. They would only sell them or rent them homes in slums. And if ever someone rented to them or did sell to them something that was in a white neighborhood, those black people who moved there would then be run out by race riots or killed, or if they defended themselves, they would then be arrested for defending themselves. Then there's the education part. Education was still segregated in the North, and basically what the school districts would do is they just wouldn't give the black schools any money. When the 1930s rolled around, the members of the Supreme Court had changed enough that people who had been fighting to try to get change in these areas were finally able to do so, as the court members recognized that separate but equal wasn't working. It wasn't an existent thing. If they were separate, they weren't going to be equal because it was easy to discriminate against the black schools. And so they eventually found the separate but equal ruling unconstitutional. But even then, it took years and years, decades, to actually get enforcement of funding of black schools, because even as schools moved to not being officially segregated, they were segregated now by location. So if you were in a poor neighborhood, your school would be bad. And as we talked about earlier, all of the black people had to live in poor neighborhoods, because if they tried to not be in a poor neighborhood, they would be killed or arrested. In the mid-40s, more than half of black adults had less than 5 years of formal education. It was in the 50s that official segregation in public services was made illegal. Obviously, it was a lot longer until segregation was made illegal in the private sector. So what a lot of states in the South did was they totally defunded all public education and gave the money instead to private schools, where it was still legal to segregate. And it took another 10 years to get that made illegal. And as you see time marching forward, you're realizing that the black children who would have been going to school at this time in the 50s and 60s, they're still alive today. And the children of these people are probably young adults in like their 30s and 40s. And it's very easy to trace their parents' lack of education to how disenfranchised they still are, because this was not that long ago. A lot of people in the US and around the world like to think that white supremacy was defeated with the civil rights movement at the very least, but also way before that, the Civil War, and it was not. It hasn't been 150 years since black people were disenfranchised. It's been less than a generation, even if you don't count all the other things that have been going on this generation. Now, there was a push in the 60s because of the space race to get people educated more. Carol Anderson didn't bring this up specifically, but this, of course, reminded me of the movie Hidden Figures, which draws attention to 3 specific black women who were instrumental in the space race. The fact that they were able to learn as much as they did and accomplish as much as they did despite all this crap is amazing. And something that Carol Anderson did bring up is how much faster would we have won the space race if all of our people were educated? And it's mind-boggling Yet even during the space race, when Eisenhower was pushing for more education for most people, he still refused to push for education for black people. As things moved forward through the civil rights movement and courts removed the ability to legally turn people away from schools and housing, etc., based on race, people still wanted to be racist, so they just used other words. They didn't say, I'm not letting you go to this school because you're black. They said, I'm not letting you go to this school because you're not a good fit. And I'm not letting you go to this school because your scores aren't high enough. And as they were campaigning and speaking in the public sphere, politicians wouldn't refer to black people as black people. They would say things like lazy people, people who live in slums, people who live in inner cities, and everyone knew what they meant, but they felt like they couldn't be called on it. People still do this. Some of them actually do say black people though, or Muslims, or Mexicans. Thinking about someone specific right now. And then they get elected, but we're not going to talk about that right now. And these politicians would talk about these people when they were complaining about handouts being given to them and help being given to them, completely ignoring the fact that this was owed to them because they paid taxes, and that it had been owed to them for 100 years, and that at no time during those 100 years had it ever been given to them, not to make up for slavery, but just to bring them up to the regular level of what white people had. Even that wasn't given to them. Then we go back to the courts, because the courts shifted greatly during Nixon's term. He was able to put on no less than 4 people on the Supreme Court, which is crazy for one presidency. I don't know why a bunch of them apparently died during his term. That seems kind of weird. But anyway, 4 brand new conservatives added to the conservatives over there meant that the courts basically gutted the Voting Rights Act, which was what made a lot of voter suppression illegal. Various types, such as closing down poll places in black neighborhoods, nowadays it's closing down the DMV in black neighborhoods because you need to have some kind of ID to vote in certain places, in the seen places, and then if you can't get to the DMV, you can't get an ID, and then you can't vote. But things that started back then were the redrawing of district lines so that the black people's votes would all be divided up so that they couldn't add up to enough to actually influence any elections, all sorts of stuff like that. And this Supreme Court basically said that not letting them do that was unconstitutional, too much federal rights versus state rights nonsense. Black people also sued because property taxes were being used to fund schools, and that is inherently ridiculous, because if you live in a poor neighborhood, you'll get a poor school, and that doesn't make any sense, and obviously shows a lot of classism in addition to racism, that poor people should always be poor. I don't know, but that's still used today, and I'm still offended by it, and people need to sue more people over that, because I think the Supreme Court is quite a bit better right now, and I think they would rule differently on that. There's probably a number of cases already working their way through the system, but they just haven't reached that point yet. But dang, that's a bad system. Then we have President Reagan. Basically, he rolled back all public services, which public services are going to extra help people who can't afford private services. So poor people, which was black people, because remember, they've been repeatedly disenfranchised for hundreds of years. Oh, and then he started the cocaine trade into America. You're thinking, why? Why? Well, this was during the Cold War, and apparently anything is justified if it's fighting communism. So there was this socialist rebellion in one of the South American countries, I don't remember which, and they put in somebody that Reagan considered a communist as their leader. And there was a bunch of gangs who were fighting this new leader. So Reagan and his administration wanted to help them and fund them. And Congress wouldn't give them the money because they didn't think it was justified. But Reagan and the CIA director at the time, who was George H.W. Bush, decided that, you know, well, what would be a good way to get the money if we sold drugs to American people and then use that money to fund this war. And there's this great drug trade going on in Panama, so we'll just like set up a little freight train from there to the US, and they needed somebody to sell it to the people in the US, and so they found this black man who was a gangster and were like, can you spread this out and like sell it and we'll give you some of the money and like make this an industry? And then he did, and it spread all across the US and among poor people, aka once again mostly being black people. Yeah. And this was a year after Reagan had announced a war on drugs, during a time in which drugs weren't really a problem for the American people. And this all sounds really crazy, right? Well, this author cites her sources very well, and she usually cites a source every other sentence. Sometimes she goes a whole paragraph, and that whole paragraph is from one source, but like, her sources are down pat, and some of them are from biographies written by people who were on Reagan's cabinet. Some are CIA documents that have been released. These are reliable sources, and I highly encourage you to look them up. Yeah, it sounds really nuts, but apparently a real thing. When I think about all the secret things that have gone in the history of the US that people didn't know about, it kind of freaks me out what's probably happening that we don't know about under the current administration. But I'm going to try not to think about that, because I can't do anything about it. Oh, and then, just to further entrench the fact that he was definitely racist, it was under Reagan that the guidelines for sentencing relating to cocaine were written, where if you have an amount of crack cocaine, which is the cheap kind, and hence the kind that poor people buy, a gram of that, it gives you the same sentence as if you have 100 grams of powder cocaine, which is the expensive kind that rich people use. Then, of course, fairly big time jump this time to Obama's election, at which time conservatives figured out, if a black person can get elected, dang, we're doing this wrong. We better get back on that voter suppression thing. So all the stuff I talked about before, shutting down DMVs, shutting down polling stations so that they have to wait long hours and sometimes time runs out, or they waste their whole day and lose their day of work or can't go at all because they have to work that day. Shutting down pre-voting so that if you have to work on the day of the voting, which is usually a weekday, you can't vote until after the workday, and then the line is too long. Also with the whole ID thing, in addition to shutting down DMVs, requiring IDs in general was particularly disenfranchising to black people, because 25% of black people at the time didn't have IDs from the government, but they did have other forms of ID like school IDs, but school IDs weren't allowed because they weren't from the government. Also 16% of Latinx people, but only 8% of white people didn't have government issued IDs. And in order to get the IDs, there were other things that particularly worked against black people, such as having to have mail addressed to you, such as a bank statement, when a lot of black people didn't have bank accounts, and they and also Latinx people tended to live in multi-generational households where only one member of the family's name would be on a piece of mail, so only one person from that family could vote, could get an ID and vote. And these are just some of the many ways that voter suppression has become a big problem again, and this really makes me want to go out and register people and help them get IDs. Sometimes I imagine a different life for myself in which I go outside and do things, and then I remember that my body doesn't work very well. So I'm just gonna keep making videos like this. So I highly encourage you to get this book, even if it is just to look up the many sources that she used and like check these facts, because I am totally behind fact checking. She documents it very well, go for it. But I hope even if you don't read the book that this has opened your eyes somewhat to what has really been going on in America and what I suspect is going on in a lot of majority white countries. Thank you so much for watching, and check out the links below. There will be stuff relating to Black Lives Matters. There will be my other What You Need to Know video, which was about women in the workplace and how women are talked over and ignored, and how keeping them out of the workplace eliminates 50% of the world's talent. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.